Okay, so I'm just going to use this resource that I picked up from Smart Group Training to help explain some of the things that we want to consider when we get a 1 on a screen in the FMS, or an asymmetrical screen which involves a score of a 1, or a 0, which would be pain in the movement. Okay, so these exercises that are listed underneath these screens are more likely to cause more harm than good when you do them. So it's worth considering leaving some of them out before we correct for those red lights or those red flags in the screen. Okay, so when we approach our sort of corrective work, there's kind of like a hierarchical approach that you want to take with it, which I spoke about in one of the articles that I wrote. But quickly, just to recap it, we want to basically focus first on any problem areas that occur in the active straight leg raise and shoulder mobility. They're the two first sort of port of calls. If they're both fine, there's no problems there, and we move on to looking at rotary stability and trunk stability push-up. If they're fine, then that's when we move into the more sort of complicated and multi-joint kind of movements with the inline lunge, hurdle step and deep squat. Okay, so if we have a red flag in the active straight leg raise, things to consider sort of omitting from their program initially until we clear that with corrective work would be sort of any full range deadlifting, any mainly hip dominant movements like swings, cleans, snatches, and then also like dynamic movements like running. Okay, so without leaving that, you don't want to leave that out forever, but what we want to try and make sure that we do is get them to a point where those problem areas in that screen are corrected for, so that we can make sure that that movement isn't being affected by poor sort of patterning or inappropriate mobility in that area. Okay, so and that applies for all these screens. All these exercises and things that you want to leave out based on a red flag in these screens would be something that you want to actually eventually get to being able to include in their program, but you've made sure that you've cleared the problem first. Okay, the problem area first. So things to focus on in terms of a shoulder mobility asymmetry or a score of a 1 would be anything like overhead pressing or open chain horizontal pressing. So like bench pressing, dumbbell bench press, plate press, and then get-ups. Get-ups is an important one because it's not necessarily seen as overhead pressing, but when you get to that full standing up position, you are in a position of full shoulder flexion. So what you can do with these things, is, if you still want to include them in the program, is just make sure you do regressed versions of those exercises. So it would be something like a floor press, or maybe just a half get up or a quarter get up where the shoulder flexion or range of motion isn't required as much. Or you could do like a landmine press for the shoulders instead of going straight overhead. Okay, so those are the kind of things that you want to leave out for the shoulder mobility. Rotary stability has more of kind of like a power emphasis on it, so we want to maybe think, not many of our clients will be doing these things anyway, but again, just be aware of, like, if you are doing Olympic lifting with clients, clean, snatches, push press, swings, anything too explosive, you want to make sure there isn't a problem with their rotary stability to start with. Okay, torso press up or trunk stability push up. The main thing, obviously, that you want to focus on if you have a red flag in this screen is improving their core stability in general, so just their ability to hold their trunk in a stable position. So regress all their core work to maybe sort of either supine on the floor or quadruped, half kneeling, tall kneeling, that kind of stuff. And obviously you're not going to be getting them to do full range press ups, you'd go for regressed versions of that, so incline press ups on the rack and that kind of stuff. Okay, so that's sort of those are sort of the key 4 screens that we want to make sure there's no red flags on initially, because they'll all have an effect on what's going on in these more sort of complex movements up here. Okay, so the inline lunge, obviously the straightforward, you want to avoid sort of doing lunges or any sort of loaded lunges especially, so that's an important factor of all these things. It's also about load. You don't want to load these patterns before you correct for them and get the quality there first. And then because it's a sort of an inline stance, can affect things like their running gait and stuff like that before you've corrected for it. Similar with the hurdle step, it's a single leg stance again, so running and jumping are the things that you want to be sort of avoiding before you've made some taken some corrective measures to make sure you're getting at least 2s on these screens with no obviously difference between left and right side, or clear difference between left and right side. And then for the deep squat, you want to just obviously worry about not going too heavy with any of the the squatting movements, and maybe some bilateral jumping you might want to leave out first as well before you clear for that deep squat screen as well. Okay, so that's just a quick overview and a nice sort of summary of some of the things, considerations you want to make when you have your final score in the FMS. And what we can do as a follow-up to this is just go through each of these screens step by step and maybe show you some of the sort of correctives that are easy to implement and probably have the sort of biggest bang for their buck in terms of getting that screen back to where it should be.